September 3rd, 1939, 240 miles northwest of Ireland. The North Atlantic stretches endlessly under a pewter sky, its surface rolling in long, hypnotic swells that have remained unchanged since the dawn of time beneath these deceptively peaceful waters. At periscope depth, Captain Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp peers through the brass eyepiece of U-30's attack periscope. The crosshairs settle on a distant silhouette, a passenger liner, cutting through the waves with the confidence of peacetime travel. The ship's lights still burn openly, a beacon of civilization against the gathering darkness. Lemp's finger hovers over the firing button in this moment. Suspended between the old world and the new, between peace and total war, the Atlantic Ocean is about to become the largest battlefield in human history. The torpedo strikes the SS Athenia at 1940 hours. 117 souls perish in the frigid waters, including 28 Americans. The Great War's promise of never again dissolves into the Atlantic depths along with the wreckage within hours. The German Kriegsmarine realizes what they have done, violated their own orders, struck a passenger vessel, handed Britain a propaganda victory before the ink on the war declaration has dried. But there is no calling back this moment. The hunting has begun. For the German U-boat crews gathering in the ports of Wilhelmshaven and Kiel that autumn, the Atlantic represented something magnificent and terrible, a vast arena where modern warfare would be decided, not by armies clashing on fields, but by predators stalking through the abyss. Admiral Karl Dönitz, architect of Germany's submarine doctrine, had long envisioned this moment. The ocean, he proclaimed, would become Germany's highway to victory, a liquid battlefield where his gray wolves would strangle Britain into submission by severing the maritime arteries that kept the island nation alive. The mathematics were seductive in their simplicity. Britain imported 2/3 of its food, nearly all of its petroleum, and the majority of raw materials essential to its war economy every week. Hundreds of merchant vessels carried this lifeline across the Atlantic: grain from Canada, oil from Texas, steel from America, rubber from Brazil. If the U-boats could sink ships faster than they could be replaced, Britain would face a stark choice: surrender or starve. Dönitz calculated that sinking 750,000 tons of Allied shipping monthly would achieve this goal within 2 years. The Atlantic, in German strategic thinking, was not merely a hunting ground, it was the key to the Reich's survival and expansion. Yet beneath this cold calculation lay something more primal for young German submariners, many barely 20 years old. The U-boat service offered a peculiar form of nightly warfare in an age of industrial slaughter. Here, skill and cunning mattered more than numbers. A single submarine, operated by a crew of 44 men, could sink vessels carrying thousands of tons of cargo and hundreds of sailors. The psychological appeal was intoxicating. To be the lone predator in the vastness, to strike from invisibility, to hold the power of life and death over the enemy's merchant marine. The reality they encountered in those first months exceeded even their most optimistic projections. Throughout the winter of 1939 and into the spring of 1940, British merchant vessels sailed with the same patterns they had followed for centuries. Convoys were small, poorly defended, and often scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. Royal Navy escorts were scarce, antiquated, and unprepared for the revolution in submarine warfare that Dönitz had orchestrated. Ship captains maintained peacetime lighting, used predictable shipping lanes, and relied on the vastness of the ocean for protection, a strategy that had served them well against surface raiders, but proved catastrophically inadequate against submarines. Oberleutnant zur See Gunther Prien became the first to demonstrate the vulnerability of this old world. On October 14, 1939, his U-47 penetrated the supposedly impregnable anchorage at Scapa Flow, home of the British Home Fleet, threading through the narrow channels that protected the harbor. Prien found the battleship HMS Royal Oak at anchor, her crew asleep in the false security of their naval fortress. 4 torpedoes sent the 29,000-ton warship to the bottom in 13 minutes, taking 833 sailors with her. When Prien surfaced U-47 in the waters of Scapa Flow and photographed the burning wreckage. He was documenting more than a military victory. He was recording the death of British naval supremacy. The German submariners called the months that followed Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, from June 1940 to February 1941. U-boat crews experienced what their commanders later described as a turkey shoot in the Atlantic, with France conquered and Norway occupied. German submarines operated from bases that cut nearly 1,000 miles from their transit time to the hunting grounds Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire became the forward operating bases for what was rapidly becoming the most successful submarine campaign in naval history. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. In July 1940, U-boats sank 195 merchant vessels, totaling 770,000 tons. August brought 267 ships and over 1 million tons sent to the bottom. September saw 295 vessels destroyed. The crews returning to French ports spoke of finding convoys scattered across the horizon like sitting ducks, of surfacing at night to attack with deck guns, of merchant captains who fired distress rockets that only served to illuminate their ships for easier targeting. Captain Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer, commander of U-99, epitomized the predatory efficiency of this period. Between September 1939 and March 1941, Kretschmer sank 47 merchant vessels and 1 destroyer, totaling over 266,000 tons of shipping. His method was surgical in its precision surface attacks at night. Single torpedoes aimed at the engine room to ensure a quick kill. No wasted ammunition on vessels already doomed. Kretschmer's crew painted a growing tally of ship silhouettes on their conning tower, each mark representing not just tonnage destroyed, but lives disrupted, cargo lost, and Britain's lifeline weakened. The human cost mounted alongside the statistical triumph. British merchant seamen faced mortality rates that exceeded those of any other service branch. Of the 185,000 men who served in the merchant navy during the war, over 36,000 would never return home. They died in explosions that left no time for final thoughts, froze to death in lifeboats adrift for weeks, drowned in oil-slicked waters as their vessels broke apart around them, yet they continued to sail, voyage after voyage, carrying the supplies that kept Britain fighting. For the German crews, this period represented warfare at its most intoxicating. They returned to port as heroes, greeted by bands and cheering crowds, decorated with oak leaves and Knights' crosses. Their exploits celebrated in newspapers and radio broadcasts. The U-boat arm became the elite of the German military, attracting the brightest and most aggressive young officers. Volunteers far exceeded available positions. To serve on a U-boat was to join a brotherhood of predators, masters of the world's largest hunting preserve. But even as German submariners celebrated their victories, the seeds of their eventual defeat were already being planted in the shipyards of Britain and America, in the research laboratories developing new detection technologies, and in the tactical evolution of the Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare doctrine. The ocean that seemed so vast and friendly to German operations was about to become contested waters throughout this period. One sound echoed across the Atlantic with increasing frequency: the brass ship's bell that marked the changing of the watch aboard merchant vessels every 4 hours. Day and night, these bells rang out across the convoys, their clear tones carrying across the water to announce that another watch had begun, that the lookouts had changed, that the eternal vigilance required for survival continued for British merchant seamen. These bells became the rhythm of endurance, marking time not in hours but in survival. Each ring a small victory against the predators that stalked them. The bells rang through the autumn gales of 1940, as convoy SC-7 scattered across 500 miles of ocean. After a U-boat Wolfpack attack that sank 20 of 35 vessels in a single night, they rang through the winter storms as HX-90. Lost 12 ships to Kretschmer's group in 48 hours of sustained attack. They rang through the spring of 1941 as the tonnage war reached its crescendo, with Germany sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. Yet for every bell that fell silent as a merchant vessel slipped beneath the waves, a dozen others continued their steady rhythm. The convoys kept sailing, the cargoes kept moving, and in London, a new kind of war was being planned, one that would transform the hunters into the hunted. The transformation began not with dramatic battles, but with seemingly minor technical innovations and tactical adjustments that would gradually shift the balance of power beneath the Atlantic's surface. In the research stations of Britain and the emerging industrial laboratories of America, scientists and engineers worked with desperate urgency to develop weapons that could reach into the ocean's depths where German submarines lurked. The first breakthrough came in the realm of detection high-frequency direction finding, known as Huff-Duff. To those who operated it, allowed shore stations and ships to triangulate the position of U-boats by monitoring their radio transmissions every time a submarine commander reported his position to headquarters. Every time he requested instructions or reported a sinking, he unknowingly revealed his location to British listeners who plotted these intercepts on charts spanning the Atlantic. What had once been submarines' greatest advantage, the ability to coordinate attacks through radio communication, became a vulnerability that allowed convoy escorts to anticipate and counter Wolfpack formations. Simultaneously, the development of centimetric radar gave surface vessels the ability to detect periscopes and surface submarines at distances that had been impossible just months earlier. The compact cavity magnetron, developed in Britain and shared with American researchers, produced radar beams of unprecedented precision. A U-boat commander who surfaced to charge batteries or make better speed on the surface now faced detection from ranges that made surprise attacks nearly impossible. But technology alone could not win the Battle of the Atlantic. The real transformation required a fundamental shift in British naval doctrine. From the reactive defense of individual convoys to the proactive hunting of submarine formations, this change found its most dramatic expression in the creation of support groups, fast, well-armed escort forces that could respond rapidly to U-boat contacts and maintain contact until the submarine was destroyed. Captain Frederick John Walker, commanding the 36th Escort Group, became the architect of this new aggressive approach to anti-submarine warfare. Walker had spent years studying U-boat tactics, analyzing their attack patterns. Understanding their limitations, he realized that German submarines, for all their success, were fundamentally fragile vessels operating at the extreme limits of their endurance. A submarine forced to dive and remain submerged for extended periods would exhaust its battery power and compressed air, making it vulnerable to sustained attack. Walker's method was relentless. When his ships detected a submarine, they would maintain contact for hours or even days, taking turns to drop depth charges while others monitored with ASTIC sonar. The psychological pressure on German crews became unbearable, trapped beneath the surface while explosions shook their hull, breathing increasingly foul air as their oxygen supply dwindled, never knowing when the next pattern of depth charges might breach their pressure hull and send the ocean flooding in. The effectiveness of these new tactics became apparent in the spring of 1941. In March, 3 of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders fell victim to the evolving British anti-submarine warfare capability. Gunther Preen, the hero of Scapa Flow, went down with all hands when HMS Wolverine depth-charged U-47 south of Iceland. Otto Kretschmer, the most successful submarine commander in history, was captured when HMS Walker and HMS Van Nock crippled U-99 in a night surface action. Joachim Schepke, commander of U-100, died when HMS Vanok rammed his submarine, crushing the conning tower and dragging the boat to the bottom. The loss of these three commanders, with their combined experience and tactical expertise, marked the end of the happy time more significantly. It demonstrated that German submarines were no longer operating in uncontested waters. The Atlantic had become a battlefield where both sides possessed lethal capabilities, where victory would depend not on technological superiority but on industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and the ability to sustain losses while learning from experience. This transformation accelerated dramatically following Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 and the entry of the United States into the war. 6 months later, the Lend-Lease program, already providing Britain with destroyers and escorts, expanded to include the full productive capacity of American shipyards' Liberty ships, produced using revolutionary mass production techniques, began sliding down the ways at a rate that eventually exceeded German sinking capacity. In 1943, American shipyards would complete over 2,700 merchant vessels, more than replacing every ship the U-boats had sunk since the war began. The symbolic power of this industrial transformation manifested itself in countless ways across the Atlantic theater, where German submarine crews had once surfaced to find horizons empty except for their victims. They now encountered convoys protected by escort carriers, their decks crowded with aircraft capable of attacking submarines hundreds of miles from the main convoy route. Where U-boat commanders had once coordinated wolf-pack attacks through unrestricted radio communication, they now operated under radio silence, isolated from their headquarters and unable to mass for coordinated strikes. Most significantly, the ship's bells that had marked time for British merchant seamen throughout the darkest period of the war began to ring with a different quality. Instead of marking survival against overwhelming odds, they now announced the routine of vessels sailing in increasingly well-protected convoys, their cargoes reaching destination ports with growing regularity. The bells that had once tolled for ships lost in the hundreds now rang for convoys that crossed the Atlantic with minimal losses, their holds full of the materials that would eventually turn the tide of war. The German response to this transformation revealed the fundamental weakness in their Atlantic strategy rather than adapting their tactics to changing conditions. Dönitz doubled down on technological solutions that promised to restore submarine superiority. The introduction of the schnorkel breathing apparatus allowed submarines to remain submerged while running their diesel engines, but it also reduced their speed and made them vulnerable to radar detection. The development of new submarine designs promised revolutionary underwater performance. But these boats entered service too late, and in too few numbers to affect the outcome of the battle. More critically, the German High Command failed to recognize that the Battle of the Atlantic had evolved from a tonnage war into a war of competing industrial systems. While U-boat crews continued to sink individual merchant vessels with skill and courage, the Allied shipbuilding program was producing vessels faster than Germany could destroy them. By 1943, for every ship the U-boat sank, 3 new vessels entered service to replace it. The mathematics of naval warfare, once so favorable to German submarines, had turned decisively against them, where Dönitz had calculated that 750,000 tons of shipping sunk monthly would bring Britain to its knees. He now faced the reality that Allied shipbuilding was approaching 2 million tons per month. The hunting ground that had seemed so vast and favorable to submarine operations now swarmed with aircraft, escort vessels, and detection equipment that made every patrol a potential death sentence. Captain Lieutenant Herbert Werner, commanding U-230 during the desperate battles of 1943, captured the transformation in his patrol reports, where earlier commanders had written of easy targets and successful attacks. Werner described running battles with escort groups that lasted for days, of being hunted by aircraft that appeared without warning, of watching other submarines in his wolf pack disappear beneath the waves without ever knowing how they died. The predators had become the prey. The climax of this transformation came during the spring of 1943. In what became known as Black May, in a series of convoy battles that raged across the Atlantic, the German submarine arms suffered losses that effectively ended their ability to contest Allied control of the ocean. 25 U-boats were destroyed in May 1943. With minimal damage inflicted on Allied shipping, the exchange rate that had once favored German submarines by margins of 10-1 had reversed completely. The statistical evidence of this transformation tells the story with mathematical precision. In 1940, German submarines had sunk an average of 46 merchant vessels for every U-boat lost by 1943. They were losing an average of 23 submarines for every merchant vessel they managed to sink. The technological and tactical innovations that Britain and America had developed were exacting a toll that Germany's submarine construction program could not replace. But beyond the statistics lay a more profound change in the nature of the conflict. The young German submariners who had volunteered for U-boat service, expecting to become knights of the sea, found themselves trapped in steel coffins, hunted by enemies they could rarely see and could not escape. The mortality rate in the German submarine service reached 85% by war's end, higher than any other military branch in any nation during World War II. The bells that had marked time for British merchant seamen throughout the darkest period of the war now rang across convoys that sailed with confidence, their escorts equipped with the most advanced detection and attack systems in naval history. Where German submarines had once surfaced at night to attack with deck guns, they now remained submerged for weeks at a time, emerging only briefly to snorkel before diving again to avoid the aircraft that patrolled every mile of the Atlantic. The transformation was complete, but its cost had been enormous. Over 36,000 Allied merchant seamen had died in the Atlantic battles, along with thousands of naval personnel from both sides. The ocean floor between New York and Liverpool was littered with the wrecks of nearly 3,500 merchant vessels and 783 German submarines. Each wreck represented not just tonnage lost or strategic objectives achieved, but human lives cut short in the service of their respective nations. Yet from this carnage emerged a lesson that would resonate through the remainder of the war and into the Cold War period that followed. Naval warfare in the modern era would be decided not by individual heroism or tactical brilliance, but by the ability to integrate technology, tactics, and industrial production into a coherent strategic system. The nation that could learn faster, adapt more quickly, and produce more efficiently would ultimately control the seas. For the German submarine crews who survived the Battle of the Atlantic, the experience marked a fundamental shift in their understanding of modern warfare. They had entered the conflict believing in the power of the individual warrior, the submarine ace who could single-handedly alter the course of history through skill and daring. They emerged from it understanding that warfare had become industrialized, systematized, and ultimately impersonal. Victory belonged not to the most courageous, but to the most efficient. The British and American forces that won control of the Atlantic learned a different but equally important lesson. Their victory had come not from superior courage or fighting spirit, but from their ability to recognize when their methods were failing and adapt accordingly. The Royal Navy that had been surprised and bloodied by German submarines in 1940 had transformed itself into a force capable of hunting those same submarines to extinction by 1943. This transformation extended beyond military tactics to encompass the entire relationship between technology and warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic saw the first widespread use of radar, sonar, electronic intercepts, computer-assisted plotting, and airborne anti-submarine weapons. It demonstrated that future conflicts would be won by the nations that could most effectively integrate scientific research, industrial production, and military operations into a seamless whole. The symbolic importance of the ship's bells that had marked time throughout the struggle became clear only in retrospect. They had rung through the darkest period of the war. When British merchant seamen sailed knowing that one voyage in 4 might be their last, they had maintained their steady rhythm through the turning point, battles of 1942 and 1943. When the outcome of the Atlantic campaign hung in the balance and they continued to ring as the great convoys of 1944 carried the men and materials that would make the Normandy invasion possible. Each ring of those brass bells had marked not just the passage of time, but the persistence of democratic values in the face of totalitarian aggression. The merchant seamen who answered their call, voyage after voyage, represented something more than military determination. They embodied the principle that free societies, when faced with existential threats, could mobilize resources and adapt tactics that no dictatorship could match. The German submarine crews who had initially hunted in these waters with such success had been defeated not by superior individual courage, but by superior collective organization. The democratic nations they had sought to strangle into submission had demonstrated an ability to learn, adapt, and innovate that ultimately proved more powerful than any individual weapon system or tactical doctrine. As 1943 turned into 1944, the transformation of the Atlantic from German hunting ground to Allied highway reached its completion, the Great Day. Convoys that assembled off the British coast in June 1944 carried over 150,000 soldiers and their equipment across waters that had once been prowled by hundreds of German submarines. Now, fewer than a dozen U-boats remained operational in the Atlantic, and these spent most of their time hiding from the aircraft and escort groups that patrolled every shipping lane. The bells that rang across these invasion convoys carried with them the accumulated experience of 4 years of oceanic warfare. They rang for merchant seamen who had learned to sleep through depth charge, explosions, and submarine alerts. They rang for naval officers who had mastered the art of coordinating complex escort operations across thousands of miles of ocean. They rang for air crews who could spot periscope wakes from miles away and deliver accurate attacks on submarines running at maximum depth. But most significantly, they rang for democratic societies that had proven capable of adapting their methods, improving their performance, and ultimately achieving victory through sustained collective effort rather than individual heroism. The Battle of the Atlantic had demonstrated that in the modern era, wars would be won not by the most ruthless, but by the most adaptive. Not by the most aggressive, but by the most innovative. The final phase of the Atlantic Battle, from 1944 to the German surrender in May 1945, consisted largely of mopping up operations against the remnants of the U-boat fleet new submarine designs, including the revolutionary Type 21 boats with their dramatically improved underwater performance, entered service too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. The German submarine arm that had once seemed capable of winning the war, single-handedly now struggled to mount even token resistance against Allied shipping. Captain Lieutenant Adalbert Schee, commanding one of the last operational U-boats in the Atlantic, captured the futility of this final period in his patrol reports, where earlier commanders had written of successful attacks and tactical victories. Schee described endless hours submerged, afraid to surface even at night, making minimal headway while constantly evading the aircraft and escort groups that seemed to cover every mile of ocean. The hunting ground had become a death trap. The war's end in May 1945 found the Atlantic transformed beyond recognition. The ocean that had once seemed vast enough to hide entire submarine fleets now appeared transparent to Allied Detection systems, shipping lanes that had been graveyards for merchant vessels became highways for the massive supply operations that supported American forces in Europe and the Pacific. The bells that had once marked survival against impossible odds now rang for routine crossings of waters completely controlled by Allied naval forces. In the final accounting, the Battle of the Atlantic had consumed more resources over a longer period than any other single campaign of World War II. German submarine construction had diverted materials and skilled labor from other military programs throughout the war. The Allied response had required the development of entirely new categories of warships, aircraft, and detection systems. The human cost, over 72,000 lives lost from all nations, exceeded that of many major land battles. Yet the strategic significance of the Atlantic campaign extended far beyond its immediate military outcomes. It established the pattern for technological and tactical competition that would characterize the Cold War. It demonstrated the crucial importance of scientific research and development in modern warfare. Most importantly, it proved that democratic societies, despite their apparent inefficiencies and political complications, possessed advantages in sustained conflict that authoritarian regimes could not match. The German submariners who had called the Atlantic their hunting ground in 1940 had been defeated not by superior weapons or tactics, but by superior systems of organization, innovation, and production. The U-boat arm that had once seemed capable of single-handedly winning the war for Germany had been overwhelmed by Allied forces that learned faster, adapted more quickly, and produced more efficiently than their opponents. The British merchant seamen who had endured years of submarine attack had demonstrated something equally important: the ability of free societies to maintain their essential functions even under extreme pressure. They had continued sailing when statistically they faced almost certain death, not because they were compelled by totalitarian authority, but because they understood their role in preserving the democratic way of life. The ship's bells that had marked time throughout this struggle became symbols not just of maritime tradition, but of democratic resilience. They had rung through the Blitz, when German submarines and aircraft sought to terrorize Britain into submission. They had maintained their rhythm through the darkest period of 1942, when Allied shipping losses reached their peak, and they continued to ring as the tide turned, as new technologies and tactics gave the Allies decisive advantages in the Atlantic battle. Each ring of those bells had announced not just the changing of the watch, but the persistence of values that no military defeat could destroy. The merchant seamen who answered their call, the naval officers who protected the convoys, and the scientists who developed the technologies that turned the tide, all represented something larger than military service. They embodied the principle that free societies, when properly organized and led, possessed resources that no dictatorship could match. As the last German U-boats surrendered in May 1945, they carried with them the remnants of an ideology that had promised to reshape the world through military conquest. The submarines that had once prowled the Atlantic as apex predators now surfaced to surrender to the very forces they had sought to destroy: their crews. Many of them still young men despite years of warfare, faced the reality that their hunting ground had become their grave. The transformation was complete, but its lessons would resonate through the decades that followed. The Battle of the Atlantic had demonstrated that in modern warfare, victory belonged not to the most ruthless or aggressive, but to the most adaptive and innovative. It had shown that democratic societies, despite their apparent weaknesses, possessed hidden strengths that could be mobilized in times of crisis. The bells that had rung across the Atlantic throughout World War II would continue to mark time aboard merchant vessels for decades to come, but they now rang over waters that had been fundamentally transformed by the struggle that had raged beneath their surface. The ocean that had once been contested by submarines and escorts had become a highway for commerce and cooperation between the democratic nations that had emerged victorious from the conflict. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic had proven something more important than the superiority of any particular weapon system or tactical doctrine. It had demonstrated that the values that democratic societies represent, adaptability, innovation, cooperation, and persistence, are themselves weapons of decisive importance in extended conflict. The German submarine crews who had called the Atlantic their hunting ground had been defeated not by superior firepower, but by superior principles, embodied in the everyday courage of merchant seamen who kept sailing despite the odds, in the scientific ingenuity that developed new technologies, and in the industrial capacity that eventually overwhelmed their enemies through sheer productive efficiency. The brass bells that had marked this transformation continued to ring long. After the last depth charge had exploded and the final submarine had surrendered, they rang for a generation of sailors who had learned that freedom's price must be paid not once but continuously. By each generation in its turn, they rang for democratic societies that had discovered their own strength through trial by fire, and they rang across waters that had been purchased at enormous cost for the use of free peoples who understood that their liberty depended ultimately not on the courage of individual heroes, but on their collective willingness to adapt, innovate, and persevere against any threat to their way of life. The Atlantic Ocean, which had been Germany's hunting ground for barely 4 years, would remain democracy's highway for generations to come. The bells that marked this victory continue to ring still. A reminder that the battles for freedom are won not by the most powerful, but by the most persistent, not by the most ruthless, but by the most resilient, and not by those who seek to dominate, but by those who choose to endure.